Wouldn't it be better that if I built the hospital that it wouldn't collapse? Wouldn't that be more important than taking care of all the people that were injured when the hospital collapsed? If I have a generator sitting someplace where it's useful, isn't that more efficient than trying to work by candlelight? If you have candles, right? Or by flashlights. It's hard to do that in terms of patient care. Wouldn't it be nice to have generators and oxygen supply systems that allow the ventilators to work in the intensive care unit? Or do we have to use nursing students and medical students to bag patients that are intubated and on ventilators? But that's an alternative, isn't it? That if you're trained to do that, then you're part of the buffering capacity. The patient doesn't die because you're there with a bag and you can ventilate that patient. That's really important. So those kinds of things, when we build these things, we can probably do more by putting our resources here than in just getting ready to respond once it's happened. And this is a little bit late, but my country following 9/11, all of the resources were brought here. How were we going to improve our local response capacity? And what they didn't do is they didn't take care of this stuff. There's a lot of money out there on response capacity, but the problem is if nothing ever happens, if it doesn't happen again, how do we know that it works? How do we know that it works? If we have an event, if we have an event, we have good absorbing capacity, the hospital doesn't fall down this time, I can demonstrate that. But it gets difficult to get money for these because if nothing happens, how do you know that it's been effective? So there's difficulty getting resources to build the buffering and absorbing capacity. So what are some examples of resilience? We could build safe rooms for a tornado or severe wind, and within our structures, we can have those things in our individual hospitals. We can use generators, etc., for the critical facilities. We could have warning and alert systems. There was not a warning and alert system in the Indian Ocean for the tsunami. It was not there. It is now. You guys have made tremendous progress, by the way, since 2004. You have, and I congratulate Indonesia. Huge, huge improvements all the way around, everywhere. I can see it everywhere as we go around. Fire retardant materials in new construction. So if there's a fire in the hospital, the whole hospital doesn't catch on fire. Doors that close automatically, walling off the area. Cross-training staff, and we should be very good at doing that. And then how are we going to meet the increased surge of patients that come, who are injured, to come to the hospital? One of the problems in people that come to the hospitals, at least in following the earthquake and tsunami, was they also brought the dead people to the hospital. Oh, wait a minute. Imagine what that does to your buffering capacity, because now, how are you going to be able to respond? You've got to take people and you've got to put them over into taking care of the dead and registering them and putting them somewhere, etc. We don't have people to do that under those circumstances. So keep the dead away from the hospital. It's hard because people look to the hospital to do something, and they don't know where to go with the dead people. Furthermore, we were talking down here about local versus outside responses, and so responses could be either local or outside. Now, one more piece. Responses are interventions to meet a defined need. We've talked about that. They can occur anytime in this whole flowchart, whole conceptual framework, and not to a specific part of a disaster. The last part is talking about risk. I've eliminated the term risk from what we talked about. And the risk is the probability that something's going to happen, and the attention today is on risk reduction. What does risk reduction mean? And what risk reduction means, I can decrease the risk that a disaster will occur by increasing the absorbing capacity, buffering capacity, response capacity, or even change the risk that a hazard is likely to turn into an event. So all those things that I do is called risk reduction, and you'll see that in the literature. That's why I brought it here. And the last part of this diagram are two things. Here's risk reduction, that if there's a risk that a hazard is going to become an event, then I can change that risk by doing something here. If there's a risk that the event's going to cause structural damage, then I can increase the absorbing capacity. That's risk reduction. If the structural damage is going to cause functional damage and I can prevent that functional damage from occurring, that's the buffering capacity. That's risk reduction. If I can change the functional damage to decrease the needs, therefore the needs for local response would be less, that's all risk reduction. And so I take a whole bunch of risks here that I can look at, and it's a long way from a hazard becoming an event all the way down to a disaster. And if you look at risk as probabilities, etc., then the likelihood of an event producing a disaster is fairly remote. The likelihood of the next earthquake of a magnitude of 5 creating a disaster in Indonesia is very unlikely now, because you're so good at doing this. And so, how can I reduce the risks? And this is a whole field of work now, and it's a very important area in the World Health Organization. If I change the absorbing capacity, buffering capacity, and or response capacity, that's called capacity building. Some people would call that preparedness. Capacity building. I'm building the absorbing capacity, the buffering capacity, or the local response capacity. That's what I do in terms of prevention. So capacity building is this way, and the question is about preparedness. And preparedness is, we talked a little bit about this, it's difficult to sell, it's difficult to demonstrate the value. We do it by doing these things, and maybe we ought to call it prevention or safety. Maybe we ought to call it something else rather than preparedness. Because preparedness is kind of loose. I'll give you the last example. We did a survey in the city of Madison about how well prepared the citizens were. We did several convenience samples, and we had people rank how well they were prepared, giving them what the standards were on a scale of 1 to 5, 5 being well prepared, 1 being not prepared. And the average score was about 2.4. So people in Madison really aren't well prepared because we don't have very many hazards. Elaine and I had a score of 2. So we weren't prepared either. We looked at each other and went, uh-oh. We are related, by the way, just so you know. So we now have a little better ability with our ability to cope with things and be prepared for when the event occurs. So, in summary, there are multiple risks. We can affect those risks. The resilience is absorbing capacity, buffering capacity, response capacity. The disasters occur when outside assistance is required. We do risk reduction by increasing absorbing, buffering, our response capacity, capacity building, achieved by increasing resilience. Now the exam. Ready? Oksana, they get graded on this. This is the Mississippi River right in the middle of the country. Actually, it's the Red River. And these are sandbags piled along here. This is a student saying he dares it to come here. So the water here is higher than the water is here. And therefore, the University of North Dakota, which is sitting here, is going to be protected from the flood. So is that absorbing capacity, buffering capacity, response capacity, or disaster? Absorbing capacity, you guys are doing well. Right on. So this is the episode I showed you before in terms of the episode in the stadium. And all these ambulances, absorbing, buffering, or response. Is it a disaster? Yeah, not unless we needed outside help, which ultimately it became for the stadium. And the last one, this is a person looking at a generator, probably in the basement. And what is this? Absorbing capacity, buffering capacity, or response capacity? Hey, you guys are great. You are so great that we're going to take a break for about 15 minutes. Thank you. Take a break.
Marvin, thank you very much for the explanation about from hazard to disaster. Now we understand very well about from hazard to disaster rather than what is a disaster, what is an event, and anything. So now we can take a break, 15 minutes, I think. Master of Ceremony, okay, and then after that, after 15 minutes, we'll come to this room again. Okay,